Chapter 3. Do you think Dad will still be home before dinner time? Stu asked. He sat down on a case of bottled water that we brought out to the end of our driveway with us, scratched a dry spot on his leg until it turned chalk white. Since it's the zombie apocalypse, of course he'll be home, I said, ignoring the part about the zombie apocalypse. 3 days into the blackout, and we still had no idea what had caused it or when the power would be back on, but I was pretty sure zombies had nothing to do with it. An emergency community meeting was being held in town today. Mr. Yardley said he'd pick us up, and we were waiting for him under the shade of the desert willow by the road, shirt collars stiff and itchy with dried sweat. I'd had a jittery feeling in my chest all morning, anxious to get to this meeting to find out what was going on, find out how soon we could expect things to go back to normal, which couldn't happen soon enough. I was sure when my dad got home, he'd want to know what was said at the meeting, too. I jammed the toe of my shoe into the packed dirt, kicking loose a big rock, then squinted up the empty road, watching for a truck. Planes can't fly into airports with no power, Stu said, speaking of Dad again. I held in an irritated sigh. Stu had been acting weird today. Sort of quiet, barely touching the breakfast Mrs. Yardley had made us before we left their house early that morning. There's more than one way to travel, I explained as patiently as I could. He probably already rented a car and is most of the way home. But why do you think we haven't heard from him? Stu asked, which was the most annoying question ever, given the circumstances. I don't know, Stu. The power's out. Maybe the Pony Express will deliver a letter. He gave me a quick stare, but seriously, we tried everything we could think of to get a hold of Dad, to get a hold of anybody outside of Lund after the first day. On a good day, internet and cell service was spotty out here, but we never had a problem calling out on landlines until now. One thing we did know, this blackout was big. That first morning without power, Mr. Yardley drove all the way up to Ely to find out what was going on, find out how soon we could expect the electricity up and running in Lund. The look on his face when he told us it wasn't just Lund without power. There he is, Stu said, looking past me. A red truck was coming down the road in the distance, sunlight glaring off the windshield. All right, don't ask him if he wants it, I said. Just, yeah, I know. Mr. Yardley pulled up with the windows rolled down, arm resting on the doorframe. He lifted his hand as if to wave, but stopped short when he saw Stu with the case of water. I pretended not to notice the way his eyes dropped uncomfortably, went around to the passenger side while Stu loaded the water and back. Mrs. Yardley's not coming, I said, moving to the center of the bench to make room for Stu. Even with the windows down, it was about 1,000 degrees in his truck. She wasn't up for it. He leaned forward to watch Stu in the rearview mirror, adjusted his sweat-ringed baseball cap, and draped his arms over the steering wheel. He glanced over at me. Thanks, John, he said with a nod. It's payment for dinner the last few nights, I said, though we both knew it had nothing to do with payment and everything to do with the fact that they were already running low on water. It didn't always seem like it, but Mr. Yardley wasn't really from around here. He had been our neighbor for a few years now, but he grew up in a city just south of Las Vegas called Henderson. Mrs. Yardley was from Ely, which isn't exactly like living in Lund either. Somehow they ended up out here, buying that property next to ours that had been sale for ages. Stuart, thanks for the water, he said, when my brother jumped in. It's no problem, Stuart mumbled, adjusting the air vents in front of him, though no air was coming out. Sorry it's so hot in here. Mr. Yardley glanced out the back window, as if there was any chance a car might be coming, and turned the wheel as far as it would go, the tires grinding in the dirt. I'm not running the AC. Thought I should probably try to conserve gas in case this drags on for another day. I groaned. I don't think I can take another day of this. Miss your Xbox that much, huh? He teased. Maybe a little, I said, which was an understatement, and Mr. Yardley knew it. He chuckled. Okay, a lot, I admitted, but Stu and I have been playing this game with a tennis ball around the house that isn't so bad. Oh, yeah? Yeah, you throw a tennis ball against any wall in the house as hard as you can, making it bounce off the opposite wall. Bonus points for distance and multiple hits in a row. Minus points for knocking down pictures or getting whacked with the ball. I've been kicking Stuart's butt. Is that true, Stuart? He cheats a lot, Stuart said, staring out the open window. I rolled my eyes. Mr. Yardley turned onto State Route 318 and sped up, warm air streaming in through the side windows and swirling out the back like a deafening whirlwind. Stu put his head against the doorframe and shut his eyes. I relaxed against the warm seat, feeling the wind gust up through the damp hair on my neck. The meeting was in the school library. Mrs. Rudman, the school librarian, was waiting at the entrance, cheeks flushed, fanning herself with a clipboard. Glad you boys could make it, she said, glancing at her watch. Well, the power's out at our place, and we had nothing better to do. Funny, John. She gave me a tight smile. Her sharp blue eyes glanced at Mr. Yardley, then moved past him to the empty hallway behind us and softened. Your dad still isn't back, she said, flipping through the papers on her clipboard. Not yet, Mr. Yardley said, clasping my brother's shoulder. Stu was staring at the floor, counting the blue flecks on the tile or something. He'll be back tonight, I quickly added. Mrs. Redmond pursed her lips in concentration. Mr. Yardley watched with interest as she found our names and marked them off with a pink highlighter. There wasn't much pink on those papers. I guess we're not the only ones running late, Mr. Yardley said. He removed his baseball cap, swiped his forearm across his hairline. That or they aren't coming, Mrs. Redmond said grimly. Stu leaned close to my ear. Zombies already got them. I nudged him back with my elbow. What was that, Stuart? Mrs. Redmond said, setting down the clipboard behind her. Nothing. Mr. Yardley had tucked his cap under his arm. One of those orange igloo water coolers that we used in gym class was sitting on a desk outside the library door, and we reached for a stack of foam cups. Oh, Mrs. Redmond stopped him with an apologetic smile. Davis, that's empty, but here. She took a paper from the small pile next to the water cooler and handed it to him. Every household is filling out one of these, front and back. Thanks, he mumbled, staring at the paper with a small crease between his eyes. Don't forget to take a pen, she added, before looking back to Stu and me. She kind of hesitated, then took a second paper from the stack and handed it to me. I guess you're the head of the household while your dad is away, John, front and back. It was a list of handwritten questions taking inventory of the things we had in our house. Questions that my dad would be answering, not me, if he were here right now. And the first one, I tried to figure out why it bothered me, why it started this strange little flutter in my chest. What is it? Stu asked, crowding in to get a look. Just a bunch of questions, I said, nudging him away again, forcing the unease from my mind. Boys, you ready? Mr. Yardley said. We took a shortcut through the maze of bookcases. Loud voices were talking over each other. Mr. Ramsey already struggling to get everyone's attention. If you could all just quiet down for a moment, he was saying, standing on the storytime stage at the back of the library. Behind him, a wall-to-wall mural of Great Basin National Park, a blue banner painted across the top, was the title of our state song, Home Means Nevada. Around a cluster of silent reading tables, a heated argument had broken out, a chair skidding across the floor as Mr. Johnson leapt to his feet. Don't tell me what I do and do not know. I'll take care of my family the way I see fit. He jabbed his fingers at his chest. Everyone, please, Mrs. Clark said over the yelling. My favorite school counselor, also the only school counselor. She had taken down one of those stiff posters that was tacked up all over the library, the one with a panicked-looking cat hanging from a tree branch with the words "Hang in there" written above, and was standing by an open window, fanning outside air into the room. Mr. Ramsey put his hand in the air, like he had a question or something. If you all wouldn't mind. Oh, boy, Mr. Yardley said under his breath, taking in the scene. Why is no one listening to him? Stu asked. Not everyone can command a room like your dad, Mr. Yardley said, and through the nervous fluttering in my chest, I felt a small swell of pride. Dad would have this room under control in a heartbeat, I agreed. Let's sit with Mr. Nielsen, Mr. Yardley said, pointing to a round table set farther back from the others. Mr. Nielsen, our closest neighbor after the Yardleys, was sitting alone, shoulders hunched, collar damp with sweat. Mr. Yardley patted him on the back to let him know we were joining him, and he turned, kind of startled, but then smiled warmly at each of us. Unfamiliar gray stubble on his cheeks and chin. Your dad's still not back, he said, looking past me as I pulled out the chair to sit beside him. He'll be back tonight, I said, though I was starting to get tired of repeating this stuff. Mr. Nielsen patted my hand, gave me a concerned smile that did nothing to help the fluttering in my chest, then glanced toward the stage. Apparently, Ramsey used to work for Nevada Power and knows a thing or two about power grids. Yeah, Mr. Yardley said distractedly. He squared the questionnaire on the table in front of him and picked up the pen. He was just starting to explain it. An ear-piercing screech came from some little kids chasing each other around the library, because I guess the room wasn't loud enough. For Pete's sake, Mr. Nielsen grumbled. Most of the older kids our age, were hanging out in the courtyard, goofing around, not filling out emergency preparedness questionnaires. I could see them from the east side windows. Did the Ericksons come back from Tahoe? Stu asked, his eyes scanning the courtyard. They were supposed to be back yesterday, I said, remembering our plans to go over to Ryan's this weekend for an old school video game tournament. I don't see them, Stu said. Well, maybe they aren't here yet. The Ericksons are never late. They show up early for everything. Stu, not now, right? I said, cutting him off. I leaned on my elbow, hand braced across my forehead, blocking out the noise around me. I read the first question again, and I decided to skip it for now. I went straight to the second one. How much water do you have for your family? This was an easy question for me. The rule of thumb is 1 gallon of water per person per day. But I didn't need to do the math. I already knew that with our water tanks and the cases of water bottle that we always rotated through our food storage, we had a 6-month supply for the 3 of us. I wrote in my answer, do you have a supply of non-perishable foods? How much? Another easy answer that I didn't have to think about. 6 months supply. Do you have a generator, solar, gas? As if we wouldn't have a generator. The first morning of the blackout, right when we got home, Stuart and I moved my dad's gas-powered generator out of the shed, ran a long extension cord through a window in the kitchen, plugged in the fridge so nothing would go bad in there, plugged in a big box fan. If I could get your attention, Mr. Ramsey said, raising his voice. Mr. Nielsen sighed beside me. He should probably put his hand down, look like he's waiting for someone to call on him. I focused on the next question, blinking down at the paper. Do you have the medication you need, a first aid kit? I pressed my fingertips into my temple, slick with sweat, filled in my answer. Hey, Davis, someone called from across the noisy room. Isn't your Lizzie due to have that baby any day now? I lifted my eyes to look at Mr. Yardley. He was staring steadily at his questionnaire, which was still blank. In fact, I didn't think he had moved since he picked up his pen. I read through the remaining questions quickly. Does your home provide adequate shelter from the heat? Do you have a radio? Do you have batteries, matches, a reliable light source, sanitation supplies? I filled in my answers. We were prepared for this. My dad had made sure of it. We had everything on the list and then some, so I didn't know why the fluttering in my chest had turned to a pounding. Then I heard something through the disorderly room, my dad's name. Don't get started on Lockwood again. He didn't predict any of this. It came from the front of the meeting, near those silent reading tables, but I didn't look up this time. I just made my hand into a fist, fingernails biting into my palm. At least he practiced what he preached, someone answered, which is more than a lot of us can say. The man isn't a saint. He's a pack rat. Stuart stiffened beside me, and my head shot up, chest inflating with air, but Mr. Nielsen stopped me, covering my fist with his weathered hand. You know what I always admire about your dad, he said to us in a low voice, the weight of his hand heavier than I expected. Up against a hothead like Mike Johnson, who doesn't know up from down, Jim never takes the bait, just stays cool as a cucumber. A heart-leaping whistle broke through the chaos, sharp and high-pitched, and Mr. Nielsen's hand left mine. Mrs. Redmond was standing red-faced on a chair in front of the bookcases. The power may be out, she said in a stern voice, trembling with anger, but this is still a library. Quiet. Seizing the moment, Mrs. Clark dropped the cat poster and hurried to the front of the meeting. Excuse me, everyone. I know tensions are high right now. I came here to get answers, Mr. Johnson shouted, not a lecture from my neighbors. I agree, Mrs. Clark said smoothly. If you would take a seat, then I think we can all agree to give Mr. Ramsey the floor and get our questions answered. And parents, let's have the children play in the courtyard. They don't need to be in here for this anyway. Is she talking about us? Stuart asked as parents began breaking up the game of tag and ushering kids out of the library. He leaned forward on his folded arms, heel tucked beneath him. Nah, she's not referring to you boys, Mr. Nielsen said. Just the kids running around screaming. What a relief, I said dryly, as if I wouldn't rather be goofing around in the courtyard than listening to a bunch of adults having a shouting match. But then I caught a hint of Mr. Nielsen's expression and immediately regretted my sarcastic response. Definitely not as cool as a cucumber. John, Mr. Yardley said, the directness in his voice catching me off guard, his attention off the questionnaire and on me for the first time since sitting down. You should stay and listen to Mr. Ramsey. He'd said it like he was apologizing for something. Sorry, John, but you have to stay here and be head of household. I agreed with a shrug, like it didn't bother me. Stu straightened. If John's staying, I'm staying. Parents, Mrs. Clark called from the front of the room. Do not get upset, of course. I'm not referring to your little ones. Nursing babies, toddlers can stay. Well, there's your answer, Stu, I said. His eyes narrowing at me. You can stay. All right, Mr. Ramsey started as the room quieted, giving Mrs. Clark a nod of thanks. As I was saying before, the Western Interconnection is a power grid that spans more than 11 westernmost states, parts of Mexico, and up through Canada. So you're saying the whole grid is down? What I'm saying is we've already confirmed blackouts in Arizona, California, Utah, Idaho. There were a few gasps as the list went on. And though news of this had already spread, hearing it again was just as shocking as when Mr. Yardley first told us. Still, I tried to focus on the fact that when the blackout started, my dad was outside this area, all the way in North Carolina. I figured that was a good thing, wasn't it? Does that mean the whole grid is down? Well, what could cause an entire power grid to go down? Zombies. Zombies, Stuart said in my ear. I gave him a sharp look, not in the mood. What? He mouthed, his hands up in a shrug, like he wasn't even kidding. Answering that question would require a lot of speculation, Mr. Ramsey said, the kind of speculation that isn't helpful. Let's work with what we do know. Who cares how it happened? I just want to know why the power isn't back yet, Mr. Johnson snapped. Yes, what is the holdup exactly? Let's keep it orderly, Mrs. Clark said. One question at a time. Mr. Ramsey, when can we expect the power to be back on? Well, I suppose it could come back any time, but... He interrupted the collective sigh of relief. If you aren't prepared for the worst, then I would start considering your options. What do you mean, Mrs. Clark said. What options? Well, if you don't have at least a 3-month supply of food and water. 3 months? Mrs. Clark said over the shouts. Are you saying we won't have power for 3 months? The room erupted then, but all I could do was watch Mr. Ramsey. He rubbed his jaw, his eyes concerned, like he was just coming to the realization that a lot of us didn't understand something about this blackout. Listen, Mr. Ramsey said, putting both hands in the air this time. Listen, he repeated. Even if the power comes back on tomorrow, food production, shipping, everything has already come to a halt across the entire western United States. There's already a fuel shortage in Ely. We can assume that's true of most cities, and with no fuel, nothing is moving up or down our highways. Think of it like a chain reaction. And way out here in middle of nowhere, Nevada, we're on the end of that chain. He paused like he expected more interruptions, but at that moment, all I could hear was the pounding in my ears. He cleared his throat. Now you were given a questionnaire when you walked in. If you flip it over and take a look at the back. I looked down and turned the paper over for the first time, surprised to see it was mostly blank, except for the words written at the top, plan of action. This is where you can work out a plan for your family. Think about the answers to those questions on the front. If you don't have at least a 3-month supply of food and water, then consider the first one. For a lot of you, that question might be the most important. It represents mobility. As you've probably noticed by the low turnout here, a lot of folks have already taken advantage of it. He paused for a moment. How much fuel do you have? Enough to temporarily evacuate your family out of Lund? I sat by the window on the drive home, staring at the blur of sagebrush and dust. Why don't you boys come over for dinner again tonight? Mr. Yardley said. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of highway in front of us. Our dad will be home before dinner, I reminded him. Stuart was silent. Mr. Yardley looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. When we got home, Stu went straight to his room, which was fine by me, because I went straight to mine. I picked up everything off the floor, made my bed, cleared off my desk. The state flag was still there from the morning my dad left town, and I made a split decision about it. I unfolded it, got some thumbtacks, and hung it on my wall properly, like Dad said I should. I stood back and stared at the emblem. Against the opposite wall, the wall I shared with my brother, a tennis ball thumped, a steady thump, 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 my heart beating twice as fast. Dad would be home that night. I let myself believe it was possible. I let myself believe that a massive power outage on one side of the country wouldn't affect travel on the other side of the country. One side grinding to a halt, but not the other. I let myself believe it until I couldn't anymore. It was late. Probably past midnight when a knock sounded on my door. Lying on top of my comforter, I took a breath and stopped all the overwhelming thoughts in my head, forced my mind to be still. I rubbed my palms over my eyes, wiped my nose on my sleeve. I'm awake, I called in a steady voice. My brother cracked open the door, and I made room for him on my bed. I gave him my pillow and tucked my arm beneath my head. We're going to be on our own out here for a while, I said. I know, he whispered. My hand was on the flashlight, resting against my leg. I thumbed it on with a click, lifted it, and shined it at the flag. At the words in the upper left-hand corner, Battle Born. My dad was right. That flag did look pretty good on my bedroom wall. The Yardleys were at our house the next day. We brought dinner, Mr. Yardley said, carrying in a pot of cooked pasta. The only problem is we have no pasta sauce. I kept meaning to get more sauce, Mrs. Yardley said, holding tight to Freddie's little wrist as he tried to wriggle away. He squealed as she pulled him back, grabbing him under the arms and lifting him to her hip. Don't worry, we got a whole shelf of pasta sauce in the garage, Stu said. Mrs. Yardley smiled in response, and then for some reason she put the back of her hand to her mouth, shut her eyes, and burst into sobs. Freddie took one look at his mom and stopped wriggling. He stuck out his lower lip, his clear blue eyes brimming with tears. Geez, it's just sauce, Stu said as Freddie let out a wail. Take as much as you want. Mr. Yardley put his arm around his wife and kissed the side of her head, rested a hand on her pregnant belly. Then he looked at me. Let's go talk, John. Out back, the sun was setting, and the sky was streaked with shades of red and orange like the distant mountains were on fire. The view didn't exactly help ease the feeling of dread growing inside me. We have plenty of food and water, I started to say, enough to share. It's not just that, John. Lizzie could go into labor any day now. She'll need help. I nodded like I understood these things. I'm just trying to decide if I should be talking you into coming with us, he said, or talking you into staying here on your own. I knew it was coming. I knew they'd have to leave, but my heart still dropped when he said it. I told him, "You don't need to do either. We're staying here." "All right," he said after a pause, and while we watched the sunset fade, we went over everything. He wanted to make sure we were really prepared for this. Stu and I had plenty of food and water. We had that generator. We had how much fuel do we need to keep the generator running? How much fuel do we have stored on our property? How much fuel did Mr. Yardley need to get up to Ely to Mrs. Yardley's sister? How much fuel did he need to get back here, back to us after the baby was born and it was okay to travel? I tried not to let my mind go too deep into all this. Try not to think about how my dad should have been talking about this stuff with Mr. Yardley and not me. Try not to think about how long we'd be on our own, and at the end of it, he gave me a way out. "Are you sure you can do this? If you're not sure, we can figure out something else." I'd never felt more unsure in my life, but I just scrunched up my forehead like I was giving it more thought. And then I nodded, "I'm sure." His lips pressed into a smile. "You know, John, you're a lot more like your dad than you think. If you say so, Mr. Yardley," I said, like I agreed with him. He took his eyes off that sky, regarded me directly. "John, you can call me Davis, all right? Some things Davis and I never went over. What to do if I was startled awake in the middle of the night by a stranger. What to do if in one night the food was gone, the water was gone, everything was gone."